Welcome back to another edition of the webinar series of the Hong Kong Holocaust and Tolerance Center. In this series, we bring survivor testimony, new scholarship, as well as topical discussions on the Holocaust, historical memory, and the fight against anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance to our audience here in Hong Kong and beyond. My name is Roland Vogt, and together with me is Glenn Timmermans. Together, we have the immense pleasure of speaking today to Dr. Bernd Wollschläger, who is joining us from his home in Florida. Good morning to you, Dr. Wollschläger.
Good morning to you too. Good afternoon or good evening.
Good evening, good morning.
I don't want to give away too much, but Dr. Wollschläger's personal journey is a truly remarkable story of confronting the past, a story of elevation and transformation. It is a story that begins in Germany, where Dr. Wollschläger was born as the son of a perpetrator in World War II, a story that takes us to Israel and the US, where he now practices medicine and is a very active and public speaker and a great inspiration in the fight against intolerance and hatred. So welcome to our webinar series. And what we have planned is a little bit of a dialogue to hear your story. And I just want to, maybe as a way of introduction, ask you about, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? And how did you get to where you are today?
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I always appreciate the opportunity either to be live or virtual, providing these presentations in order to shed light on a part of history that people are still uncomfortable to talk about. And for me, as a German, born in May the 9th, 1958, I belong to, and I still belong to, the first and a half generation born after the Second World War. And I grew up in Bamberg, Germany, which is a gorgeous city. I'm not working for the tourism industry in Bamberg. It's a gorgeous Bavarian city in the north of Bavaria, nestled between Nuremberg and Würzburg. It's a historic city that was untouched by any wars. It's like a living, breathing museum. So I grew up with history all around me. We were prepped to understand history, what famous queen, pope, and so on lived and died there. Bamberg is called the Rome of the North, by the way. And one thing I noticed in this intense approach to history, and to make us understand how that we should be proud of history, our history, that a certain aspect of time nobody talked about. Now, I was 8, 9 years old. I didn't have the understanding what was going on politically, but I understood one thing. There was a war. And in a war, people win and people lose. And the fact that they're in a town of 75,000, there are about 10, 15,000 American soldiers and family members stationed there, means that we didn't win that war. So that I figured out as a child. But nobody talked about that war. That war immensely impacted on the entire society, and nobody talked about it. When I asked my parents at home about that war and where we're from, where my grandparents from, I was told they're gone with the war and we're moving forward, we don't talk about it. So I had no grandparents, dark hole, a black hole, nobody talked about it. But through my insistence, my father and my mother started to talk about their lives as much converged in my life. And I heard two different stories. From my father's side, glory and honor. From my mother's side, terrible disaster, loss, and death. So very contrasting stories. So my father's story started when we had walked in the forest. He was a hunter. He taught me how to fish, how to hunt. And we had a lot of time together and spent quality time together. And these long walks, he told me about over and over again that he was the youngest tank commander in the German army, serving in an elite tank unit under the command of General Guderian, the father of the German Blitzkrieg, in as such battled on every war front in Germany and abroad, of course, from the attack on Poland, 1939, the attack on France in 1940, and then the following year, 1941, in July, the Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the former Soviet Union. And that pushed forward my father. The elite unit conquered a town several hundred miles west from Moscow. And for that accomplishment, he was awarded the Knight's Cross by a man who we still refer to as his Führer, Adolf Hitler. Now, 8, 9 years old, I had no idea who Adolf Hitler was. I couldn't put it in the framework, what was that about? But I knew one thing, my father's a hero. And my mother, was completely different. My mother was telling me a story that she was a Sudeten, she is a Sudetendeutsche, an ethnic German living in Czechoslovakia at that time on the border between the West Czechoslovakia and the German border. And 1.5 million people, ethnic Germans, and all of them were either murdered or evicted to the last person. And she lost everything. Beautiful father, my grandfather, beautiful merchant business, beautiful villa, everything gone. So honor and horror. These two concepts percolated in my mind, but I knew that something is still not, I didn't use the term then, kosher, because I was confronted with things of the past that nobody wanted to talk about. First of all, my parents rented an apartment in a huge building in downtown Bamberg. It's a patrician-style 19th century massive block building. We lived downstairs in an apartment, and the entire upper floor was taken up by the landlady. And my mother told me, do not talk to the landlady. She's a noble woman, a countess, unless you're spoken to. And right next to the hallway, in the hallway, right next to the wooden stairway leading upstairs to the countess's apartment, was a painting of a man mounted on the wall who looked like my father in uniform, whose pictures I saw at home. Uniform, officer's insignia, knight's cross around his neck, officer's cap. And when I asked my father who this man was, at least depicted on the portrait, my father told me, do not ask questions. He was a traitor. Now, the man he designated as a traitor, or called a traitor, was no other than the portrait of Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, the German colonel who led the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944, which unfortunately failed. He was immediately executed the same night with hundreds of others, and his wife, Nina von Stauffenberg, lived upstairs, his widow. And from her, I heard stories that my father did not tell me. Not that because I was, you get an audience, it's just when I sneaked upstairs to her apartment in the Sunday afternoons when my parents were having a nap after lunch. I played with her grandchildren because there were plenty of them, and they were upstairs and I heard them playing. And I saw and I remember in this apartment, wall to wall, this huge apartment, picture after picture after picture of her and her husband in happy times, smiling, a family, a beautiful, kind of beautiful Neverland atmosphere. So why is my father talking about that this man is a traitor, a bad person? How can that be? And that motivated me to immediately, over the years, to get closer and closer to history that actually Nina von Stauffenberg shared with me. And I had to understand that there was not only glory and not only horror from my mother's side, there was glory and horror from my father's side. And I decided to find out about it.
About your father, I mean, like what was his story? How did he end up being this, joining the army, and what kind of influence did he have over you and your life?
Well, first of all, maybe it's hard to understand, but my father, I loved him. First of all, you only have one father, normally, and I loved and adored him, specifically that he's this hero, this larger-than-life figure, and I had no idea what was behind. Well, he was born in 1917 in Berlin, and actually in a rural area outside Berlin, the then capital of Germany, and reared in a family with, I think, 5 brothers and 4 sisters. And that was a national, very proud family that insisted that they're living for hundreds of years in Germany, that gives them certain rights and status. My father, my grandfather was an officer in the 1870 war against France. My grandfather was a veteran of the First World War, and my father was a veteran of the Second World War, so a family of warriors. And my father was sent in the age of, I think it was about 15 or 18, to the called Napola, the West Point of the German army, National Political Education Institute, an indoctrination central, so to say. He was indoctrinated to be not only an officer, a proud officer of Germany, but also a National Socialist and swearing allegiance to the Führer, not to this country, to the Führer. So my father was a strict nationalist. At best, at worst, a fascist and a National Socialist.
Why do you think your father clung on to that faith, as it were, in the Führer, etc.? I mean, just forgetting about Hitler's crimes against the Jews. I mean, Hitler destroyed Germany. I mean, how did your father maintain faith in a man who had actually brought about your mother's expulsion from the Sudetenland, etc.? And how did he still manage to maintain that faith in?
That's a good question. Like many others, he belonged to a group of soldiers, officers who served their country. That's what he told me. And serving a country is an honorable thing. Serving your country shows that you're defending your country as a true nationalist. And for him, this was logical. Now, he stuck to this idea years and years afterwards, at least 15 years that I know, because when the war ended in 1945, in May 1945, he was left with nothing. The Führer committed suicide, didn't take responsibility. The leading character of the National Socialist elite, Goebbels, Himmler, and Heinrich, all were gone or committed suicide. So he was in this bittersweet statement that he once made, all of those that I followed chose to get the backdoor exit. And I'm the one to eat the rest and facing the rest. So he was arrested as a National Socialist and officer. He led a desperate attempt at the then new Tiger tanks in April 1945 in the direction towards the Ardennes, where the American troops came after literally from the Ardennes trying to cross the Rhine, the River Rhine. And he blocked 5 tanks and hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. Of course, it was a suicide mission. And he was thrown in a prison, actually in a prison in a cell, he always told me. He was interrogated for at least 2 years. He was an American and British prisoner, and he was released as a low-level National Socialist. The national denazification is a different level. He was a lower level, not the lowest, but he was prohibited from getting any kind of jobs that had to do with security. He was a peddler going from door to door. This frustration had come from the elite falling down to the level of a beggar. I think he was frustrated and angry and didn't understand why he, who followed all the rules, was the victim. He didn't clearly communicate that he was sorry about it at all, what happened. Actually, he was supporting the murder of the Jews when we finally came to talk about it as a necessity of history. And actually the world should have given him and the German people a medal to get rid of the Vernons, these Untermenschen, underlings, and free the world of those that have no reason to live. He was convinced that that is something that Germany had to do.
But he was, in a sense, he was lucky that he was arrested by the Americans and not the Russians.
Well, I didn't touch that question, but the the Americans had enough aggression and anger against the Germans what happened in the Ardennes.
Sure.
In the winter of 1945 to 1944.
Where war crimes were committed as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. They came down on him as a representative.
You mentioned
and your mother. I'm sorry. So your mother. So they obviously met after the war, after your mother was expelled from Czechoslovakia.
Actually, my mother and my father married during the war, 1943. She met him when the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia, or actually Czechoslovakia in 1938. She met him in 1939. Of course, officers were housed in homes of German citizens, so to say, and German nationals. And so he met my mother to one of those arrangements, and they married before the war.
And your mother, did she? I mean, she had the story of horror of her background, but how did they, as a married couple, reconcile? Did she agree with your father on the Führer front? I mean, or did she? I mean, is it something which was that a point of contention in their marriage? This, well, the difference.
Actually, as far as understood, not. And you have to understand the mindset of husband and wife relationship in the 1930s Germany was: the man is the man of the house and the wife is the wife of the house. Just not to intermingle with what I'm doing. I'm not obligated to tell her what's happening. I think the closest they come to a co-understanding when everything was over and he was, despite all of his efforts, and he was wounded in the war, severely wounded, that he gave everything and nothing in return. And she confronted him and said, look, we've started a new life, but military has taken everything from us. He didn't accept that. He was a proud German and proud officer. Actually, in 1956, when the West German army was reconstituted under the guidance of the Americans, my father was called upon by the American occupation forces, it's still at that time, to serve as an instructor. He was a lieutenant colonel, and he got a lieutenant colonel rank, to serve as an instructor, tank instructor for American soldiers and for German soldiers, to literally to emulate a blitzkrieg in case of a Soviet attack. So he was elevated again on the level of a participant, which for him was something that he wanted. It was kind of remorseful he did that because his Führer was gone, but he felt obligated to do that for his country, Germany, or at least West Germany.
I suppose for him it was some sort of vindication, I suppose, if he's called upon to.
That's correct. That is correct.
Yeah.
I wanted to come back to this silence that you spoke about in post-war Germany, that the black hole of the 12 years between 1933 and 1945 that people did not talk about. In your experience, when did that start to crack, and what did that do with your parents? Like, did they, in the 1960s, in the 70s, when that became a more topical and open debate in the public, did that also change? Did you confront your parents directly, or
Well,
how did that work?
that's a very loaded question, and let's put it like that. From 1945 to 1954, Germany was in full occupation, at least West Germany and East Germany too, divided by a wall, of course, or the Iron Curtain. And in that time, people were, I don't defend the Germans, they were busy to rebuild. The cities were destroyed. Against just a city like Bamberg was a big exception. Cities were totally destroyed. Rebuilding forced them to focus all energy on rebuilding their home and their country. And so the excuse was not to deal with it, it's over. Be moving forward, whatever happened. We cannot dwell on the past. Now in 1954 and 1955, one of Germany's first presidents called upon all the members of the resistance and surviving members of the resistance and their families to meet in Berlin, and in the Benterstraße, in the street, in the building where about 20 resistance fighters were executed, including the Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. He asked for forgiveness, and he asked for a new Germany that is built on courage and civic duty. And that started a movement forward to identify those murderers. And in 1961, 1962, the Auschwitz trial took place in public. So for the first time, our generation, at least who could go to, who belonged to our generation, could go there and see and listen and read what happened. And that followed by also by an electoral victory in 1969 by Chancellor Willy Brandt, who was the first post-war German politician who was not tainted by the past. In the opposite, he was a communist, a socialist, I'm sorry, who escaped Germany in 1933, returned to Germany in 1949, and rebuilt the Social Democratic Party. And in December 1970, he traveled to Poland, and in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, on a cold December day, he sank on his knees, bowed his head, and asked for forgiveness that Germany had did. And that was a symbol that we're moving not only forward, but we have to take the history in our consideration and learn from the history. That is where my generation kicked in. Now, we're the young generation against the Nazis, or were they for the Nazis? Well, the young generation wanted to understand what happened. What happened that was so massively impactful in our society? What happened and why that 6 million Jews were murdered, not as collateral damage of war, like my father often pointed out, but as a deliberate politic of an elected government in Germany. That was the Germans, not some hoodlums and Huns. These were Germans who did that. So that started the process of understanding, truly understanding the past. And for example, in our school, we didn't talk about what happened in the past to that detail until the horrific events of 1972, the murder of the Israeli athletes in Munich.
Were you able to talk to your father about this?
Well, yes. We had a very good relationship. I adored him.
Were you the only boy? Were you the only son?
That is correct.
Right.
We had 2 sisters. One sister lived outside the house. But for my father was a hero. And this notion that he was a hero was reinforced by the fact that at least once a month, his old friends, war buddies, came to our house to celebrate the good old times, singing the good old songs. And I remember these impressive men, all officers, one of them a general, and looked at me and said, "You must be so proud of your father because he's our hero, he's your hero, he's a national hero. Be proud of him." I mean, if you're a little munchkin, 7, 8 years old, what can you believe in? And I wanted to believe that he's this Übermensch. Now, we came to talk about the past in bits and pieces because things happened and nobody could avoid. First of all, the 1972 Olympics in Munich, with the murder of the Israeli athletes by Palestinian terrorists, brought back the past. And when I asked my father, because in the school we started to talk about the Holocaust, when I asked my father "Father, what is the Holocaust?" My father looked at me and said, "It's a lie. The teachers are communists." So he discarded that. So there would be one clue. Later on, I asked him what happened to the 6 million Jews we learned in school that were murdered. So that was collateral damage of war. They were combatants, and according to the Geneva Convention, civilians who carry a weapon can be killed. The Geneva Convention, the rules of war don't apply, which was, of course, total nonsense. And when he finally admitted in a conversation that I had with him, and he was totally drunk, He told me that he knew about the Holocaust. And actually, I found out 20 years after his death, several items that corroborated my suspicion. Number one, a letter that my father gave I think it was his personal adjutant, personal officer that served with him. He asked him to make sure that 670 prisoners, Russian prisoners, will be transported immediately by train to a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau for final treatment. Now you have to understand, Auschwitz was not only the death camp and a death valley for Jews, it was also for Russian soldiers who worked there. So he knew what it meant, and he knew what happened there. Then I found a picture of him sitting next to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, in a meeting in, I think in 1942 in Russia, where the German colonel sits together with the head of the beast, Heinrich Himmler. They were not discussing tank tactics. It was about securing territory for mass murder. The army did secure the territory. So the army knew and officers knew, including my father, what happened. Absolutely what happened. So my father was a liar.
Were you able to pinpoint your father to any particular atrocities in Operation Barbarossa? Obviously,
no.
They were the Russian prisoners to Auschwitz, but in terms of the killing of Jews in Ukraine and elsewhere, have you able to pinpoint him to any area there? Or?
That's a great question. The answer I can give, according to the denazification protocols, which were found by a military historian who contacted me out of the blue about 10 to 15 years ago. I got part of most of the denazification protocols that were hidden or stored in the former East Germany and Russia in historical archives. And when the Soviet Union collapsed or imploded, something like East Germany, we had access to all this material. And if there was this denazification protocols do not indicate that he was involved in atrocities, otherwise he wouldn't be been released. But that he was beyond joining, and he was not joining the party, he was joining the ideas that Adolf Hitler promulgated. And I think he was kind of in the twilight zone before the interrogators, American and British, but he was not an active participant, but he was a high-ranking officer, participated in the war. And for them, thoughtfully, we have to take that into consideration, the Americans were not looking for war criminals after a few years in Germany anymore. They're looking for officers and soldiers who could defend Germany, the Western Alliance, from Russians. So the denazification protocols were done quickly in order to rebuild Germany and reconstitute an army.
Mm. And in 1972, with the killing of the Israeli athletes, I mean, that was obviously big news around the world, and obviously big news in Germany. So is that when you mentioned that? So what happened then? That's when your father obviously had to talk about the Jews, or? Well,
the Olympics in Germany, in Munich 1972, were supposed to be the event to demonstrate the world that Germany is a new country. And is not the country of Adolf Hitler, it's a country of back in high culture and literature. And the emergence of Willy Brandt as the prime minister underlined that he had a tremendous moral standing in the Western world. I recall by memory pretty well what happened in 1972 because it was such a
You were about 14, yeah?
I was 14, exactly. It was a traumatic event. My parents purchased the first TV, black and white though, invited friends over in our house, and there was this glorious moment when watching the athletes parading to the stadium. Everybody was clapping, wine, food, beer. It was just a celebration of Germany's back on the limelight. Now, I remember one team parading in the stadium carrying a flag with a star inside, and all the adults started talking, almost hostile behavior. They didn't want, this was the remembrance of the past that nobody wanted to deal with. And I asked myself, why? That's another team, Israeli team. I had no idea what it meant. Why did the adults react like that? Why? And then 10 days later, when the murder happened and Israeli athletes were murdered in the Olympic Village apartment, actually by PFLP, the most radical faction among the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. In Germany, everything came to a halt, not only in the Olympics, but also in Germany. And in the negotiations that were led directly face-to-face with the Minister of Interior, with the head of the hijacker, Issa, it was concluded and agreed upon that the German army would fly them by helicopter with the hostages out of the center of the Olympics to the nearby military airport, Fürstenfeldbruck. And there an exchange would take place. The Israelis would fly with the hostages would fly with the terrorists to an Arab country. and then a release should take place in the Arab country between the 200 or 300 Arab prisoners in Israeli prisons. And I remember this moment like it was yesterday. After the helicopters landed, explosions, firefight, lasting for over an hour. And then the statement on the TV, in the beginning, everybody believed they survived from it. When an American journalist turned towards the camera, exhausted at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, looked into the camera and stated, they're all gone. The German police tried to intervene, fighting with guns against highly trained and highly killers, so to say. And in a firefight, everybody was killed, including the Israeli hostages. Of course, one of the terrorists threw a hand grenade in a helicopter, which exploded, and everybody perished in a fireball. The other one, helicopter was sprayed as machine gun fire. Everybody died. And the next day, that picture that changed the course of my life, with a picture in every German newspaper, 2 helicopters on the tarmac, one burned out with the charred remains of the Israelis inside, the others with the body of the Israelis, well, partially covered with linen, and a huge headline, Jews killed in Germany again. Now, I speak perfect German. I did speak German then too. The again part I didn't get. So I asked my father, what does it mean? Again. My father told me, look what the Jews, do to us. They always blame us for the misery. We cannot tolerate those Jews anymore. So the victims as perpetrators and the perpetrators as victims. And that's where I took off in finding out about my father and took the spiritual journey that finally brought me to Israel.
Bernd, you have an amazing story to tell, but I don't want to delay you, but I just want to keep you at this period for the moment. Sorry, there's so much more we want to hear from you. Something which just intrigues me personally. Stauffenberg, von Stauffenberg. How do you see him? I mean, I have a problem with people like him because they were pretty supportive of Hitler until things went badly wrong. I mean, there is the one exception for me is von Moltke, who seems to have been resistant throughout. The people like Stauffenberg and Rommel and others, how heroic are they? I mean, were they anti-Hitler, or were they only anti-Hitler once Hitler was on the wrong side, as it were?
Well, you're asking a very perfect and important question, because that's what the Americans asked themselves. We have a group of renegade German officers who swore allegiance on Adolf Hitler, but wanted to protect their own country because he saw it was going down. How much are they Mitläufer? They're just doing anything to be in the limelight and not to be held responsible? Or are they truly convinced freedom fighter? What did they do until then, before 1944, when the events happened? So it was doubtful from the Americans, from the British, from the coalition, that these are democratic representatives that we can work with. Now, I knew the family from living there in their household. From the age of 8, 9, and 10, I had emergent conversations with, not deep conversation with his widow, Nina von Stauffenberg, but I saw her again multiple times afterwards. And for me, he was a true nationalist. He didn't like Jews, but he thought for the Jews, what they need is a homeland and get out of Germany, wherever they can go, because they don't belong here. He didn't support the Holocaust. He didn't support the mass murders. It was a very courageous family. Just to take consideration, his brother, Alexander, married in 1938 a woman whose name was Melissa Schiller. She was a converted Protestant. Her parents converted to Protestantism. She grew up as a Protestant. And she was because of her skill as a pilot, she was Aryanized by Goering. She was made German because they needed her skills as a test pilot. She married Alexander von Stauffenberg, which was also in 1938 absolutely verboten, because according to the Nuremberg law, different races should not mix. So it was a courageous family, a very courageous family, but the doubts remain. Why so late? There are two explanations why so late in July 1944, because nobody could come close to Hitler in his heydays. And most importantly, Hitler enjoyed tremendous support by the population until 1941, 1942. And how can we murder or kill, assassinate a tyrant when the majority of Germans supported him? That was the consideration of the military brass. We find an opportunity whenever it's possible that we can assassinate him, create a new government, and fight and ask for American support to fight the Russians. The Americans were not willing to do that. They wanted to go the whole enchilada to the end. They didn't trust him.
Interesting, thank you, because I think you're the first person I've met who knew the Stauffenbergs. I mean, I know people who I've met the von Moltkes, but you and I'm just very curious. It's a question which has always intrigued me and bothers me about that.
Well, I knew his son. I think he's still alive. Was a general in the West German army, with whom I communicated last about 10 years ago in an interview. But he explained to me that way. So it is. His father was a hero and a nationalist, but probably a tragic figure in German history, because he could have stopped the death of millions and millions of people, but it didn't happen.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Roland.
Yeah, let's come back to this issue of when you said the events of 1972, and then you said basically like this opened your eye to this new kind of spiritual journey that you embarked on. You ended up deciding to convert to Judaism and eventually do Aliyah to Israel. Can you tell us a little bit what motivated you and what led to these events?
Well, about 2 hours I need for the answer. Just kidding. 1972 was the point where nobody could avoid talking about the Jews, murder of the Jews, and the Holocaust. Everybody started to talk about, and first of all, the term Holocaust is not, I want to apologize for it, but the term Holocaust was not coined until 1978, 1979. It was not part of the lingua franca in that until then. So the mass murder of the Jews, 6 million Jews. That is something was not done by a group of Huns invaded Germany, killed everybody, and then disappeared. And hunky-dory returned to democracy. It was done by a democratically elected German government. This was done by the Germans in the name of Germany. And I couldn't reconcile that. I felt tremendously shameful. I wanted to understand why them, why the Jews. In that journey, I approached my former ethic teacher. He was a former Jesuit priest. He was teaching ethic and religion. And he told me, look, Bernd, the only thing what we can do as Catholics, we have to make amends. I said, amends to whom? The Jews. I had never met a Jew before. I was an Orthodox Catholic because my mother was an Orthodox Catholic. She sent me to Catholic kindergarten, elementary school. I was an altar boy. She wanted me to become a priest, which didn't work out, obviously. So I was literally embedded in this faith of the traditional Catholicism. And I understood that something terrible was done. And in this group that my former teacher had, a group that he organized, bringing Israelis from Israel, Jews and Arabs to Germany once a year to intermingle, learn from each other, and then you always invited a German participant, and that year it was me in 1979. And of course, when young people come together, that was before Google, Schmoogle, and Internet, we talk to each other. What music you like, what food you like. I like the Israeli girls a heck of a lot. And one of them bonded, and she invited me to come to Israel, which I did 3 months later. And I remember sitting in her apartment. My parents lived in Haifa, in a working class neighborhood called Nefesh Shanan. And they were waiting for me outside the building, chit-chatting with me in Hebrew, embracing me as if the long-lost son. Took my luggage and my rucksack, brought me to this apartment where there's just a 1.5 bedroom. They gave me the bedroom and they all squeezed into the rest of the apartment because I was a guest. And in first dinner I had in an Israeli household, in Israel ever, they tried to feed me anything that is different from what I've known before. And her father looked at me and tried to talk with me, and I barely understood what he meant. So he looked at me and said, Bernd, if you want to speak German, I still speak German. And I asked him how to come. He rolled up the sleeve of his forearm, showed me the number tattoo. Ich war in den Lagern. I was in the camps. And I was shocked. What should I do? I'm first time in Israel, first time in a house of a Holocaust survivor. What I wanted to sink in the ground. And he said, look, Bernd, it was not you. I want to understand why your parents did that, if you learned from this. And I told him, I don't know.
So he was aware of your father?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a few days later, he traveled with me to Jerusalem, to visit the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem. And he took me by my hand, my hand and his hand tied together. And he walked me to the exhibit. And in the end, I was emotionally basket case. How can it be that this family that showed so much hospitality, that this country who doesn't persecute me because I'm a German, these people can start a family, a profession, to build an old country anew? There must be something special. And on my way back to Germany, I pondered the question, how should I learn from Jews? And lo and behold, in the small Jewish community, remnant of the Jewish community in 1980, about 25,000 Jews lived in Germany, and you couldn't get into the temples at all because it was sealed off by police. You had only needed special ID to get in there. But one small community in Bamberg, in my hometown, opened the door for me. There were over 30 Holocaust survivors, and they had all from Poland. And the chair of the Jewish community took me under his wings, and because I wanted to learn, and he asked me to come every Friday, every Saturday as a Shabbos goy for a non-Jew. That's the non-Jew who participates in the preparation for Shabbat, lights the fire and do the work which an Orthodox Jew cannot do. And I learned, it came every Friday, every Saturday, week by week, month to month, year by year. The closer I came to this family of choice, the more I removed myself from my family of origin. I was not rejected by them. I learned the mannerism, the language, I absorbed it like a sponge. And of course, by distancing them from my family, came to a blow up. And one of the major blow up was even Christmas fell on or Christmas Eve fell on a Friday night. And I choose to go, for Friday night, I choose to go to my Jewish friends instead of my family, for which my mother, the Orthodox Catholic, was crucially important that we have every year a family meeting, going to the, I can play it like in my mind, going to the Holy Mass, then afterwards have traditional food, lentil soup and carb. Then we're waiting for my father to ring the bell, to open the massive oakwood doors to go into a living room, huge Christmas tree, my father standing next to the Christmas tree with the finest dark suit, the night cross around his neck, singing festive Christmas hymns. And I was not there. When I came back the next day, my father was yelling, my mother was crying. I said, look, stop the great Greek tragedy. Are you aware that you're carrying a blood-stained medal symbolizing murder? You're a murderer. Your blood is on stick. The Jews that you murdered and those in your generation. Do you think we can whitewash that? And he looked at me, raus, get out. Well, it was a little problem, no money. I was in the second to last year of the medical school, so I had a scholarship, but not enough. And my Jewish friends helped me through. I never asked for money. And I was part of their life. One of them specifically, who never talked to me in the 5 years that I was together with them in the community, his name was Aaron, approached me, looked at me, gave me 100 mark and said, kauf dir neue Sachen, buy new stuff. Deine Schuhe und deine Jacke sind schmutzig, your shoes and the jacket is dirty. Of course they were not dirty. And I walked over it was a Shabbos in the afternoon, I walked to Itzhak Rosenberg, the chair of the Jewish community, my friend, offered him and said, look, Aaron gave me 100 mark. He looked at me, Aaron gave you 100 mark? He doesn't give you nothing. Why didn't you ask for 200? I said, why should I? I said, it's a joke, sit down. You have not understood so far that we are damaged by war. Physically, we are alive, but mentally and spiritually, many of us are dead. I rebuilt my emotional life, my family life, the ability to love by meeting a German woman non-Jewish, who helped me to go through this valley of horror. But Aaron, we know he was in Auschwitz. Nobody knew what happened with his family. He was the only survivor. And Aaron told me a story about 6 months before he died. He told me a story about what happened in Auschwitz. And that story was too gruesome even to fathom. He was a member of an Einsatzkommando. Einsatzkommando were Jews. They gave the permission to stay alive for 90 days. Walking into Sonderkommando, walking with the victims to the crematorium, opening the doors to the shower area and say, look, give me your number. The clothing will wait on the other side. You can pick it up and identify with your number. And herded them, they Jewish Sonderkommando herded the fellow Jews into these gas chambers, and the SS started the Cyclone B insurrection. He told me it took about 20 to 30 minutes for everybody to die. It was not that fast. And then the other side is Jewish Sonderkommandos pulled out the bodies, burned the bodies, crushed the bones, and threw the necks in the pit next to the crematorium. For that, they got a 90-day reprieve. Aaron was one of them. Aaron died, and Itzhak asked me, look, we need somebody to say Kaddish, the prayer of the dead. At the graveside, he has no family. You were his friend. Say it. I said, Itzhak, I'm not a Jew. You're one of us. When I said the Kaddish, I crossed the line. I knew that was the world that I never can return to. And I asked Itzhak, I want to become a Jew. I want to be whole again. I don't want to stand in two worlds. One leg in the world of Germany and one leg in the world of Judaism. I said, well, I feared that would happen, but for that purpose, I send you to a rabbi in Frankfurt. Do not come back on this. You get out these crazy ideas out of your mind, because you can be a righteous man, but you don't have to be a victim like us. And the rabbi refused, and I met him every 3 months. And every time I met him, I asked him the question, when can I convert, until the March of 1986. And he finally agreed and said, whatever happened, I will send you to the rabbinical court in Germany. It convenes in December 1986. They can decide either way. But until then, you have to commit yourself to Judaism physically and spiritually. Don't want to go into the details, but it involved a little surgery. Had to be done in a facility, in a kosher facility in Switzerland, in Basel. Then I traveled 2 months later to Metz in France, immersed myself in a mikveh, in ritual bath run by a Hasidic community. And in December 1986, I converted in a very strict fashion to Orthodox Judaism. And I remember the chief rabbi looking at me and asked me, you haven't gotten my vote yet, and you need it. Why does a German with that tragic story want to become a Jew? That's not enough. I said, and I gave him the answer. I said, I want to do something good in my life, with the life I've been given, because my family was my family of murderers. Well, I was approved, and within a month I was qualified myself for according to the law of return, to return to Israel. I got a visa from the Israeli embassy and the Jewish agency. I got a passport, actually a travel document. They collected my German passport, and I traveled the night before I traveled to Israel, tried to say goodbye to my family. My father didn't want to speak to me. He was yelling and screaming, "Du bist ein Verräter, you're a traitor." My mother was crying, she couldn't talk to me. And I arrived in Israel the next day, was assigned to a kibbutz, an agricultural collective farming, learned Hebrew. And 6 months later, was assigned to a hospital to learn in central Tel Aviv, to get my Israeli license, my German license up to par of the Israeli license. 1 month later, I surrendered my German passport already. I was qualified for the draft, did officers training, and was assigned to a unit, a combat unit in the West Bank in Ramallah. This was the first year of the first Intifada, the Arab uprising. It was a war zone. And I remember when my commanding officer stood with us all in full battle gear. I was a lieutenant at the time, and the recruits standing in front of me and said, "Guys, this is your doctor called," you have to change your name, Dr. W. "And this is your I'm the commanding officer. If something happens to me, it's him." And here I was standing, fully armed, in a war zone as a lieutenant, and I asked myself, if they find out that I'm my father's son, and they find out my father's a murderer, they will kick me, they will throw me at best in the Arab city, and they kill me. And so out of fear, I threw my past in this virtual closet, threw the door shut, turned the key in the lock, and tried to throw the key away. Until my son, 10 years later, asked me a simple question. He was 14, 15. His name is Tal. "Dad, who's my grandfather?" So how could I escape this question when my parents escaped this? To give me the same question, and they didn't want to talk about it. I told him from the beginning, when he asked the question, this is my story. And he was very impressed. Needless to say, that I would talk in school about it. I said, no, don't do that. 3 weeks later, to my luck, they had a family history day. And Jewish school, Orthodox school, everybody talked about their heritage, going back to the House of David, I guess. And my son raised proudly his hand and snapped with a finger. And my grandfather was a famous Nazi. Needless to say, that's a little problem logistically in the Jewish school to say that, because I was called ASAP to the office of the principal. And the principal said, "Dr. Wollschläger, you're a respected member of our community. Your son told us this verdrehte Geschichte, this crazy story that your father was a Nazi. What kind of drugs is he taking?" I said, "He doesn't take any drugs. He's not affected by this divorce at home. He just told you what I told him." And the rabbi looked at me. I was present during the session. "Bernd, did you ever talk about it?" I said, "No, come with me." And the first time I talked about it, that what happened, I never wanted to happen. The shame was lifted off my shoulders. The weight was lifted off my shoulders. And I finally wanted to close the circle of life that opened so many years ago for me and my family. So I traveled with my children, my son, my daughter was too young, traveled with him to Bamberg to visit my parents. They were all long gone. The only place to visit them was in the cemetery. And ironically, I mean, no pun intended, my parents' grave is located 2 rows, 1 row parallel to the wall that separated the Christian from the Jewish cemetery. Not unusual in Bavarian towns, because Jews and non-Jews live together in farming communities. And I told my son, "Look, this is the irony of the history, that your grandparents' grave, my parents' grave, is here in the shadow of history. What does it teach us? It teaches us, as Jews, to make every effort happen that it never happen again, as Germans specifically, And I, as a German, I stepped out of the shadow, looked back to understand what happened, learned my lessons, and moved forward with a commitment that this will never happen again on my watch. And I was probably willing, and at that time, when I was asked, anybody asked me, what would I be able to do? I said, I have no money, at least at that time. I had no rank yet or experience in medicine when I was in Israel. The only thing what I was able to give is my body, my skills as a soldier. And so I stayed in the Israeli army for 3 years, and finally were able to reconcile my world that I created versus the other world that I come from, never denying it again. And most importantly, trying to convince others to listen to the past, learn from the past, because it's not about me. It's not about what personal choices I've taken. It's about us as fellow humans, as fellow Germans, as fellow Israelis, as fellow Chinese, as we go through the entire history as people, that we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past if you don't learn from them. And regardless what system you're living in, you can make a difference. Everybody can make a difference to understand what happened and never to repeat that.
Was your, I mean, do you think your motivation to study medicine was in any way to make atonement, to do good? I mean, at what age did you realize you were going to become a medical doctor?
I may have to disappoint you. I was not choosing medicine only because I was convinced that medicine is that what helps me to overcome all the hatred and what I experienced. I chose medicine because you could be independent. Right. And I knew to be independent for me would mean go anywhere I want, work everywhere I want, and be independent. Money was, of course, the second motivator to be independent. And that I'm a very passionate physician, even though what happened in the United States, I'm committed to my profession and to the oath that I've sworn. But most importantly, I was able to, as a physician and having been able to travel from country to country and offering my skills, and if I'm not in Miami, is to allow myself to learn much more from other people and allow myself to encounter people that are different to me, but have similar experiences. Because it's pretty arrogant to say, I understand what happened in the world. I understand what happened in the world through the eyes of other people, that we share information and the same commitment. Something like that, a genocide, can and will never happen again.
And your children, I mean, are you, so it's a personal question, but do you live fairly orthodoxly, or I mean, do you keep kosher and all those things, or
modern? We call it
modern Orthodox.
Yeah, but Orthodoxy has different venues. So modern Orthodox, for example, like the Chabadnikim, the Chabads, committed to the principles of Judaism, not necessarily going to synagogue every Friday or Saturday. So that is what the Chabadnikim, the Chabad movement, emphasizes, not to be according to your own choice, but according to your own abilities. My children living in Miami, my daughter lives in New York, my son is an attorney in Miami, and my youngest daughter in astrophysics, which I have no idea what she's doing, but she has a brain that I don't have, a mathematical brain. My older daughter lives in New York, as I mentioned before. She's a physician assistant in Lower Manhattan in a Presbyterian hospital.
Do they have an affiliation with Israel? They have Israeli passports?
Yeah, sure. They're all Israelis, because I'm an Israeli. Her mother is Israeli.
Right. And now, do you spend much time in Israel? You go back regularly?
I go back, well, until the
COVID.
I don't go into that. I've traveled to Israel at least 2 or 3 times a year to be professionally engaged in projects that they had to offer. And so I'm emotionally, physically, and professionally very deeply committed to Israel. Why do I live in Miami? Many people ask me a very simple reason. It's the Holy Land. I'm just kidding. No, we came to Miami because after the 91 war, the first Gulf War, my wife lost it. I mean, I say it with all due respect. She said, I cannot handle it anymore. She's an American Israeli. And I had only one family here, and my son traveled with her to Miami, settled there with the idea after 3 years of internship and residency training, I would go back. Didn't work out. So I'm pending back and forth.
Again, it's a personal question, but I think it's important. Have you met hostility from some Jewish communities or individuals because of when they discover your past, or like your father, your background?
Absolutely not. The opposite. I mean, initially I was ashamed to be a German. I was ashamed to be my father's son. I was ashamed about so many things that locked myself up and didn't talk about it. I'll give you one anecdote. As an officer, before you go rank higher, I was a captain and you rank higher in a different area. I'd undergo military intelligence review. That was a problem for me because I didn't say the truth.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And they found out that I didn't. There was inconsistencies. So they thought I'm a spy. I said, I'm not a spy, but I was unable to express this. It was so deep locked in that even in the face of sophisticated interrogators, would even do a lie detector test with me, I couldn't open up. And it was the opening up came with the help of my children, with my son's simple question, Dad, who is my grandfather? And what I did was the right thing. For me, 99.9% of people had a positive attitude, and specifically Jews had a positive attitude towards me, congratulating me. I shouldn't be congratulated. I just did what I personally, human being, should do, faced with the circumstances. Would they have choices? What I tell my children, you always have two choices in your life, to do or not to do what you're supposed to do. God, whoever you consider, doesn't make this decision for you. There are guidelines, that ethical guidelines and guidelines of behavior that allow you, if you understand them right, to choose one way or the other way. But nobody will make this decision for you. I made my decision.
In the years when you had this shame, as it were, thing you were unable to talk about, did you ever consider change your name to something more Hebraic?
Well, I have a Hebraic name. It's Dov Ben Abraham. My nickname for everybody is Dov.
Your family name.
It is a great question. That is a kind of a dafka. In Hebrew, it's dafka in spite of.
Yeah.
My father was a National Socialist, and my battle against my father consumed part of my life. I, out of defiance, kept my name and even made it the middle of my father's name, the middle name of my son, Tal Arthur Wollschläger, to say, I don't have to be ashamed of how they call me. I don't have to be ashamed to close myself in and lock the door. I don't have to be ashamed by taking another name. I stand up for that. What my father did, I take full responsibility. And what I did for is something I cannot atone by money. I cannot atone by words. I can only atone for something that I'm convinced that was wrong, and I make every effort to never happen again.
Okay, thank you.
Nowadays, you frequently do public speaking events to young people. How do they respond to your story, and what is the message that you emphasize to them?
Great question, Roland. And don't misunderstand me, but the Holocaust is a term that is been fading away and replaced with certain commercialism or identification. That said, people use it for whatever purpose, and that should never happen. The Holocaust was, is, and it will be the most horrific example of collective mass murder, of murdering people that had no reason to be murdered, by taking away entire generations in order to depopulate Europe with Jews. That was the horrific experience of the Holocaust. For what younger people unfortunately don't understand anymore, they're so emotionally, it's so from the time departs, as the time gets longer and longer and passing, they have a hard time to identify. There are no survivors, or hardly any anymore. There's no eyewitnesses. So we have to approach it from a different way. It's called genocide prevention. To understand that genocides take place even after Auschwitz has taken place. For example, Rwanda, in 1994, the almost 1 million wild butchery with two tribes killing each other. Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in 1974, 1975, creating a Stone Age form of primitive rule, millions time. We have Syria, 500, 600, 700,000 people we don't know died in this orgy of mass murder. You have to ask yourself, did we learn? No. What we need to do is create a universal faith, not a faith in religious form, a universal conduct or code of conduct that allows us, if you're Jews or Christians or Muslim, whoever, that allows us to abide by principles that protect human lives and makes us human again. And there's nobody to blame in this generation that this country or this people are responsible. The Germans did this, the communists did this. We have to look at ourselves. What can we do to avoid things like that happen? And that is the biggest challenge that we're facing. The biggest challenge we're facing in this world that is divided instead of united. It's more and more tribal. And in the face of this horrific catastrophe that we're facing in the pandemic, we tribalized. We go back into tribes. Instead of collaborating, we confrontating each other. So it's beyond just genocide. It's beyond learning that we have to do what is right to do, not living in denial, having a clear understanding what we want to, and be proud of the people that we belong to. There's nothing wrong about nationalism, but act together.
How do we teach that? How do we? I support your vision, but that's what we try to do. But I mean, how? It's difficult.
There's a very simple thing what you can do. You don't need money. You don't need a pencil. You just need to respond to words of hatred, because words of hatred are plenty. I've been in the last year multiple times had to face anti-Semitic slur in my practice as a physician, and I know what to do. But what we need to do, what I tell my students, what I tell when I travel into presentations, wherever they are, I tell them, look, words of hatred cannot be stand there and left unanswered. Because if they're left unanswered, they form the mind of others and sprout in deeds. And if these deeds left unchallenged, they form habits. If these habits prevail, characters will evolve. And these characters will then promote the development of social norms that makes it okay to kill people. It's from words to deeds to habits, from character to the point of social norms. In Germany, everybody was convinced that is right what we did. So my father, I mean, I don't want to defend it. Everybody, I would say 99%, was convinced that what was happened to the Jews was right. Mm-hmm. And after the war, they just were living in denial, facing the obvious, tremendous horror that they left behind. So we need to never forget that, and insist that when words of hatred are uttered, to respond, not to react, but to respond. Because from words comes deeds. That's no clear cut.
Do you go back to Germany much?
Oh yeah, I had. Well, I'm working for the German airline Lufthansa, so I have the possibility to fly to Germany on a regular basis. And I do that not because I want to burn my tickets and go to Israel, but because I wanted to be committed to want to understand what's happening. I'm left in 1987, so most of my adult life lived abroad. I want to understand how people think today. So I gave a presentation about 5 years ago, just an anecdote, in my hometown for the first time ever. And I was invited to a school, about 10 in a private school, 10 students in attendance, and sitting in a circle. They were about the age of 15, 16, some 17, special education. And so learning this ability to, so not those who would represent the elite and the elite, but I wanted to speak to them. I wanted to ask them, they wanted to have the possibility to ask the question. So after I finished my presentation, one young girl, about 16, 17, looked at me and said, I don't understand what you said. I said, uh-oh, my German must be really bad. And I said, I understood what you said in the context, but what do you mean? We are all the same. Why can we separate ourselves? Because why? Because they had encounters with Jewish community centers, Jewish youth, trips with Jews that come from other cities. And the Bamberg community grew to about 1,000 with the immigration of the Russian Jews in 1989. Many of them came to Germany. Mm-hmm. For me, it was important to hear, they are not different to us. It was just a conviction, they're not different to us. So when we have the ability, like I thank grace of God still have, to speak, to travel, I do it not for me, because I'm not the hero. I never want to be a hero. My ego is larger than life anywhere, my wife said. So I don't need an additional ego boost. I want to participate in helping people to understand that you can do something by standing up and counter the word of hatred with a word of reasons.
Your story obviously has, yours is a very powerful story, but I imagine it has particular resonance in Germany.
Yeah.
I talk to German youth who also then have to think about their great-grandparents or the grandparents, or I suppose in their case, great-grandparents. But obviously it must have particular resonance in Germany.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And in Israel, my book was translated in German and in Hebrew. And I almost each time that I travel to Germany, somebody asks me a question, knowing people I don't know. Mm-hmm. And these are not in my book kind of questions. These are, I have a family, I have a father, and I don't know what he did. Like one lady sent me an email. I have no idea who she was or how she is. She's 62, like I am, 63. And she has no answer, and this vexes her and it hurts her what her father did. I mean, there's an emotional ballast that you schlep around, that you carry around. This is not something that goes away, even in the second or third generation. Just we need to approach it in a way that everybody can understand what is behind the hatred against certain ethnic groups, the genocidal tendencies because we don't respect each other. And we have, like I say in German, wehret den Anfängen, count at the beginnings. And that's what you have to do.
Do you worry about Germany today with immigration? Is that likely to lead, it is leading to a rise in the far right and that sort of thing? Do you think Germany is well insulated against hatred given?
Well, this question is a loaded question, but I can tell you from my personal experience since I left Germany and coming back at least once or twice a year, Germans have learned. Not because they were initially forced to learn, forced to confront the reality, but learn that one can only be a German if you stand up to the past, a healthy feeling of nationalism. I remember when I was hitchhiking in 1976, I was hitchhiking with a friend from the German border to France, from France to the Côte d'Azur, kind of this kind of coming to age kind of trips. And when we were asked where we were from, we said from Sweden, from Scandinavia. We were ashamed to show our passport. That has changed. From the top to the bottom, coming from the top, German government, even the new German government, there's a commitment from right to left, politically, that Germany carries a responsibility that we cannot just abdicate and say that it happened in the past. So that's the good news. Are far-right groups available? Of course, there are far-right groups anywhere. Where I'm concerned is the United States of America. Mm-hmm. We have the largest neo-Nazi movement in the world, providing logistical information to the groups in Europe. We have, and I'm not getting political, just in policies, an association of these groups coming out of they were guided out of the morass, allowed to look around and see if they accept it again by a certain political move to the right. Now, this is worrying me because they're armed and dangerous. These are our governor of Florida, who is a skilled politician. I'm not supporting him, as a skilled politician. Asked the legislator to allocate, I think, about $10 or $20 million to create a personal force of volunteers, of National Guards volunteers. They're not under the control of the National Guard, of the federal government, of the state government, differently under his guard, under his command. Now, in a democracy, when you enter in any country, it swears allegiance to the flag or allegiance to the country, but not to the person. Mm-hmm. So if you have these tendencies, this nationalistic tendency, that's where my fear comes from. Rising the challenge of democracy by groups that are living according to General Hayden. General Hayden, unfortunately, had a stroke 2 years ago. General Hayden was the head of the CIA and the National Security Agency. Brilliant man. In an interview about 3 years ago, he said, we're living in a time of post-truth and pre-fascism. The truth is made, you don't have to listen to what people say. I, the leader, conveys the truth. And this truth you can believe in. And I show you what to do. This is the big concern. And may sound a little bit provocative, but I don't understand why America, and I'm an American too, with an American passport, why as Americans we have to emphasize that we're coming in the name of freedom and democracy. In our own home, there's no freedom and democracy. That's my provocative statement. And other countries in the world have the right to criticize America based on that, because our democracy is going down. January the 6th was a turning point. Sure. That led us all to understand what can happen. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that people can live on this planet together, can create technologies to protect and save our planet. And for that, it takes collaborations among all of us, regardless what ethnic group or national group you belong to. That need to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Roland.
Thank you very much for sharing your story, sharing your reflections and insights. It's really fascinating to see this journey and the decisions that have taken and motivated you to confront the past in the way you did. And also thank you for sharing the suggestions for how we can approach with younger generations this attitude towards critical reflection and also trying to prevent intolerance as best as we can.
Thank you for inviting me.